We now want to get into the conversation of the week, including, of course, later on, we'll be discussing this headline. We'll get into the zooming part later on. Of course, our headline today having talked about a plan to put civil servants on job contracts, quite controversial there. Well, of course, Mr. Geshinga and myself will be getting into the ramifications of that in just a few minutes. But first, Ken, we've had this really big conference in Nairobi. Kenyans, Americans discussing trade. What do you think might have been the major thing out of this conference?
Many thanks, Wakaba. Indeed, the US-Kenya relationship appears to be getting deeper and deeper.
Yes.
I think it's part of our strategic, both economic strategy and also I think geopolitical strategy.
Yes.
America needs a partner in Kenya and Kenya needs a partner in the US. So I think it's an opportunity, particularly for the big tech companies. I think those seem to be the ones that will make the biggest tractions.
Yes.
What we call the Magnificent Seven.
Yes.
The Microsofts, the Googles, but also other industries. We're seeing the semiconductors space coming in. So I think it's NVIDIA. So I mean, you look at a stock price like NVIDIA, it's gone up 49% year to date.
Wow.
So as you said, it's a red hot space, but I expect other sectors to continue.
Yes, and we are seeing on the sidelines of the conference the announcement by STL about the investment of some $400 million into building up infrastructure for them across different countries over the next 6 years. The first tranche of that, I think about 110 million, going to put up 2 facilities in Nyeri of all places. This is massive, right?
Absolutely. We always think of Nairobi as the heartbeat of everything.
Yes.
And I think it's fantastic that a place like Nyeri can be able to be a pioneer in what is a red-hot industry in the semiconductor space.
Yes.
So for me, I think it's kudos to the founder. I think he's done an immense job.
Yes.
And I think it's going to build on other technological developments in the sector.
We have also seen, of course, the fact that Kenya is trying very hard to balance, if at all that's the word, to grow its balance of trade in a positive direction with the US. What do you think needs to happen in this space? Do you think this growth of this kind of industry will actually dent the negative balance of payment that we have?
Not quite. I think if you look at our biggest exports to the US, they tend to be around textiles and apparels.
Yes.
And I think there is that need to be able to export more. Now, agricultural produce has been very difficult to export to the US.
Yes.
They have a very tight regulations, particularly the Food and Drug Administration. But there is that need to be able to correct that balance of trade.
Yes.
But obviously, I think it's still a long way before we get our balance of trade. But I think the longer term picture is about creating jobs. And I think that came out through the AmCham Summit, that we need to create high quality, meaningful jobs. Very bullish on manufacturing.
Yes.
Our plans to take it to 20% of GDP. It's right now it's in the single digits.
Yes.
So very bullish prospects. But as an economist, I ask myself, are we putting good foundation in terms of tax policy? Do we have good fiscal policy? And I think for me, those are the areas where I think we need to unpack a bit. Including
putting up things like special economic zones around organizations like STL and its technology park, rather than the focus on things like Naivasha and vehicles, that sort of thing. Anyway, moving on past that, the other big announcement we've seen is the investment by Pepsi, of all companies, into a plant in Western Kenya. Generally a place where they do consume lots of soft drink, known for their appetites. Do you think, they have said about 500 jobs, 5,000, not 500. Kenya has not been an easy market for Pepsi. They've come and gone several different times, this time coming in from Uganda. Do you think that this time round the environment might favor them?
I think it might favor them because the country badly needs jobs.
Yes.
The government is well aware that our high unemployment rate is not sustainable. So I do believe as part of the greater US-Kenya relationship, that there'll be very big focus on the big investors who have the potential to create jobs on the ground. So you might find policies will be crafted to be able to enable them to succeed. And I think that would be really exciting for that part of the country.
Then let's get into it. This other different conversation here, I think that's quite visible. My camera person doesn't need to zoom in. Of course, this plan to turn the contracts that civil servants have from permanent and pensionable, it's been there for a long time, to contract. is this really feasible, especially knowing that since independence, a lot of our senior people, the core of our civil service, has actually opted to work for government rather than going out to the EABLs and the other companies that offer bright people jobs. Because you can create a life in the civil service, have a pension to retire to, and that kind of thing.
Well, I think it will be a very, very difficult proposal. As you've said, there are people who have invested blood, sweat, and tears to get capacity, to build capacity, to get training, and to be able to offload that within a 3-year contract doesn't seem very feasible. Secondly, to be able to attract talent. You can imagine the private sector is bubbling with talent, but who would be willing to leave a banking job or a telco job for a 3-year contract? So also attracting the right talent will be a challenge. And thirdly, it will be the issue of now corruption and nepotism. Because what happens after the 3-year contracts, it will now come down to who do you know, how well are you connected? So it starts breeding a culture of corruption and nepotism. So I think it's a proposal that will need to be reviewed. I think it will be very, very difficult to execute it.
Let's think about government and the way it usually runs, especially around the critical aspects of security, things like education and that sort of thing. I've seen instances where the government will pick you as a young person out of university, you've learned public administration. They ship you off to Eastern Europe, Hungary, or some other country where you get your master's, and then ship you off somewhere else where you now do in-depth training and learning in some critical aspect of government, anything from civil registration to military affairs and that sort of thing. And you spend 10 years, literally, learning to become a civil servant who can drive an economy and the nation forward. And then to come back and tell you, here's a 3-year contract. I mean, it's literally weird. We've seen lots of examples of Kenyans with experience going to the UN and that kind of thing. It doesn't even make economic sense in the first place.
You know, it's what we call the virtues of the civil service. And these virtues are cultivated over time, many times decades. And there are people who are oriented towards the civil service. I'm sure you'll remember the famous play, The Government Inspector, by Nikolai Gogol. Really talks about the idea of the civil servant. So this is not somebody who can really pivot in the sense of the private sector. This is the government administrator par excellence. So these are qualities that sometimes are not very common. And when you get them, you want to put them in the right offices. And I think you have to cultivate them. And there's been no incentive for people to invest in talent when you know within 3 years you'll be out looking for another job in a very different area. So I think there still needs to be a bit more participation in that policy, particularly with the younger segments of the civil service that really had expected to be able to get through a permanent and pensionable career.
Some things even require institutional memory. You can imagine the presidential guard and waking up and saying, why so-and-so today is a bomb expert, his contract expired and we have to go find him. But over and above that, I do think the government might seem to be speaking out of both sides of its mouth. Consider the fact that one of the reasons that Kenya is in a debt hole today is lack of long-term funds. Pensions are critical to long-term funds. Financing everything from government borrowing on bonds and that kind of thing to financing infrastructure development for long-term projects like roads, bridges, those critical aspects. The main reason we don't have this is because government literally was not paying this pension money into a fund. It was just something that's gazetted and not essentially provident, if you get what I mean. You'd tend to think that with government as the largest employer, we'd be working towards ring-fencing their pensions so that this can then start to be the answer to the financing challenge we have over the long term. Why isn't this the case?
Well, I think there was a gap right from the mid-1940s in terms of the non-contributory scheme. But I think with the rise of the superannuation fund, the PSSS, I think that will be a game changer. It's only 2-3 years in the making. It's still at Bima House, so a lot of people confuse it with the old scheme, but I am made aware that in June they'll be getting their own premises. So I think this will be a game changer in terms of being able to balance what people are bringing in and the payouts, because if you don't get the asset liability matching, you can definitely end up with a broken pension system. So I think a superannuation scheme, I think that will definitely bring some correction.
Be the answer to
but yeah, it'll take some time, and I think they do need to detach themselves from the traditional model that have been at Bima House.
In 30 seconds, the conversation around qualifications and how it's visibly impacting the sort of discussions we have, including this. The fact that if a person who actually understood what the job contract means to that person, what the pension means to the economy, the floods, for example, if we had senior engineers in place who understood that floodplains are dry when it's dry and sunny, but turn into flooded rivers and that sort of thing when it's raining, and that shouldn't be sold and built upon, we would not have the challenges we have now.
I mean, that brings back to the human resource capability planning, and having the right people in the right offices can be the difference between life and death.
Yes.
Whether it's a flood, whether it's an accident, whether it's disaster management. I think the country is slowly realizing that and this is a country with incredible skills.
Yes.
Our human capital is what separates us from Tanzania, from Uganda.
Yes.
But being able to allocate it to the right areas, and not just in the public sector, but also in the private sector, I think is something with technology we should be able to do right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Indeed, very pertinent thoughts, and thoughts that we'll look into as we go forward into the week. Thank you very much for your time, sir, for coming into studio. And of course, to remind you that this conversation does continue once a week, looking back at the week as it happened and making sense of the big decisions and big announcements that have been made. Well, we want to bring it to a close right there.